great to see you all here. It's great to see you all in this building. It's one of the reasons why we chose to have it here instead of in the Union, instead of at Lilas, instead of various other places on campus, because we think it's really important to be in this space, especially under the circumstances today. My name is CJ Alvarez. I'm the faculty advisor, I guess, of this symposium. I first read Anglos and Mexicans when I was a first-year grad student in my first Borderlands seminar taught by Ramon Gutierrez, who has joined us here from Albuquerque, formerly University of Chicago. Now I teach Borderlands history here at UT. Some of you are under the mistaken impression that I did something for this symposium. I was just a faculty advisor. I sat around at a bunch of great meetings with 3 of our outstanding grad students who did 99.9% of the work, so I want to introduce you to them. Yeah, let's So Peña, right here, had the idea for this. He might be Montejano's greatest fan, which is a long list. And he's at the very top of it. Luis Martinez right here, and also Paul del Bosque back there. Three of our own who have put together what I think is an extraordinary program, managed an extraordinary array of logistics, and I couldn't possibly be prouder of them. So get to know them, thank them, talk to them over the course of the next couple of days. And there will be, before the plenary session later, more announcements, more gratitude to all the sponsors that helped us put this on. But right now, without further ado, we're going to jump into the first panel. Paul is the moderator, so I'm going to turn it over to him, and then we're going to hear from these folks right here. So thank you all for coming.
All right. Let me try and do this without the mic. I think we can do this without the mic for now. We'll see how it goes. But again, thank you all, everybody, for coming. When we assembled the panels for this event, first of all, it was extraordinarily difficult to identify the folks who could weigh in a rich and pluralistic kind of way, because when we consider the extent of the influence of Anglos and Mexicans in the making of Texas, it's almost an overwhelming mental exercise. However, that being said, when we put together the first slot with Dr. Sonia Hernandez and Dr. Benjamin Johnson, I immediately said, I want to moderate that panel. These are 2 of my favorite historians, and I'm thrilled to be able to have a conversation all together. And so let's begin. Let's begin with Sonia Hernandez. She received a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Houston in 2006, and is currently the George T. and Gladys H. Abell Professor of Liberal Arts at Texas A&M University. She specializes in the intersections of gender and labor in the U.S.-Mexican borderlands, Chicano history, and modern Mexico. She has published in Spanish and English. She is the author of the award-winning books Working Women in the Borderlands and For Just a Better World, Engendering Anarchism in the Mexican Borderlands, 1900 to 1938. With the support of an Arts and Humanities A&M Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, and an NEH Fellowship, which was cut short by DOJ, she recently submitted her book manuscript, which re-examines the 1901 case of the near lynching of Gregorio Cortes from a transnational and gender perspective. She is a board member of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, co-founder of the nonprofit Public History Project Refusing to Forget, and a current president of the Alliance for Texas History, a nonprofit organization whose mission is, quote, to foster a comprehensive understanding of the rich and diverse history of Texas. Benjamin H. Johnson is professor and graduate program director in the history department at Loyola University, Chicago. He is the author of numerous works on the U.S.-Mexico border and environmental history, including Revolution in Texas, How a Forgotten Rebellion and Its Bloody Suppression turned Mexicans into Americans. Border Town, The Odyssey of an American Place, and Escaping the Dark Gray City, Fear and Hope in Progressive Era Conservation. Most recently, he published Texas, An American History. Johnson is also a member of Refusing to Forget, a public history project devoted to commemorating the legacies of the border violence of the 1910s, which has received awards from the Western History Association, the American Historical Association, and the Organization of American Historians. Johnson has served as co-editor of the Journal of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era, currently co-edits the Journal of Texas History and the Weber series in New Borderlands History at the University of North Carolina Press. He is a member of the Texas Institute of Letters. Let's welcome all. Dr. Hernandez, we'll begin with you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to all the wonderful organizers, especially the graduate students. Thank you for organizing this important event. When I was invited to be part of this symposium in honor of David Montejano's work, specifically his now classic Anglos and Mexicans in the Making of Texas, I immediately went to my bookshelf to grab the book. I wanted to see the book. And I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. 40 years since it was published. And I thought, I wonder what Dr. Montejano is thinking about his book right now. As I thought about what Montejano's own reflections might be, and thinking of how other scholars in general look back at their own work, I began to think of my own journey from the first time I read Anglos and Mexicans. Now, remember, all this time I had the book in my hand, and I began to sift through the pages, and I realized I had lots of sticky notes. I mean, they're really hard to miss. I thought, was I obsessed with sticky notes? And it turns out that I was, and I still am. So I want to share this journey with you through a sticky note type of timeline, through the words, phrases, and thoughts I jotted down for the first time back in 1998. And in 1998, as I was finishing my bachelor's degree in Spanish and history, I was a double major, and as I was waiting to begin my first graduate seminar in Southwestern history at what was then, at that time, the University of Texas Pan American. I was getting ready to take my first seminar in Southwest Studies with Professor Roberto Salmon. And then I read the book again in the early 2000s as I was working on my dissertation at the University of Houston with Professor John Mason Hart for a course of modern Mexican history. He didn't assign the book for that course, but I had chosen to write about Mexican-American women's labor for my historiography paper, and Montejano's book was the first book in my bibliography. Then I read the book again when I was writing my first book between 2008 and 2013, and after that I lost track because it literally was on my desk every time a graduate student stopped by to talk about comps. And I think Leslie Torres here can you're a witness. It is required reading for all of my graduate students at Texas A&M. And it was required reading when I was at then UT Pan American, teaching there until 2014. So sticky note timeline here. First sticky note, yellow sticky note, scribbled on it, market forces. Reading Anglos and Mexicans, one quickly becomes aware of the enormous weight of what was essentially an expanding capitalist form of production with deep ties to the Mexican North, and how market forces were informed and further shaped by people's interactions with each other as they engaged in economic relationships, equally shaped by people's viewpoints, attitudes about business, trade, their views about the use of land. These market forces and how people played the market also had much to do with a person's class, both economic class and social class, racial and gender ideas about division of labor important. Montejano's rich, detailed account of such market forces and analysis of who played the market the best, when and on what terms, has been a discussion that has stuck with me for a long time. It had such an influence on my own work, I began to think about the connections to the Mexican Northeast, specifically Tamaulipas. You know, the history of Tamaulipas in terms of its political economy, it's almost a mirror image of Texas. And this led me to focus my research energies on how Mexican and Mexican-American women engaged those precise market forces as workers themselves, as creators of organizations and collectives to improve their livelihoods and that of their communities. Sticky note number 2, a blue note, scribbled on it, working class culture, and los que quieren ser americanos, or affluent Americans, in my mind at that time, back in the late 1990s. I grew up the 6th daughter of a working class family of 7, and every summer my sisters and I helped our father in his gardening business. I never really mowed any lawns. My sisters did. I was a wimpy kid, and in many ways I still am. I did other things considered pretty low on the list, like sweeping, pulling weeds, and that kind of thing. But quickly I learned it was tough work. But I remember my dad saying, it doesn't matter what you do, it doesn't matter what kind of work you do, you have to do it with pride. And so I did, and I learned the value of work from my father very early on. I was about 10 or 11 years old. So early on, I was so conscious of class because my father's patrones, my father's bosses, were really all of Mexican origin in a place like McAllen, Texas. So I had very little memory of racism, and it was, for me, my experience dealt more with classism. And that one bit, my father made sure that I never forgot. I never forgot about that experience. So reading Anglos and Mexicans, especially the latter chapters, was so eye-opening for me. I could relate to so much that was in the book, but it also exposed me to what one could call the intersections of class and race. And my experience was not, my experience and my family's experience was not in farming, and we were not migrant workers, but we were part of that working class culture in the Rio Grande Valley that was so crucial in the making of the entire region. And Anglos and Mexicans legitimized my childhood experience. Sticky note number 3, yellow note scribbled on it, labor control. One of the most striking reads for me was in part 3, a chapter entitled The Web of Labor Controls. To read about the various creative ways to retain labor in South Texas was so eye-opening for me. I had heard growing up from my father's relatives, his father was a Tejano from Edinburgh and his mother was a Norteña from Tamaulipas, about what they called las reglas del trabajo, or the rules of the job. And it wasn't until I read this chapter that what they were talking about, what my relatives were talking about, was when some of the relatives had to show a pass or some kind of slip, some sort, to go and work at the next ranch or to go work at the next farm or nearby farm. My relatives spoke of how reputation was so important. They had to maintain their reputation as hard workers to be able to keep their jobs, move from job to job, and to support their families. But I never understood it as a type of labor control. Later, that one chapter helped me frame my dissertation in 2006 that incorporated the Mexican Northeast, expanding, what was a labor history of men and women in some of the most menial jobs in the eyes of many, but for them, important jobs. And jobs that, while they lacked status and honor tied to capital and resources, they possessed honor by claiming they were hardworking, good workers. And this discussion inspired me to trace how those labor processes and forms of control worked on both sides of the border. That same thread appears in my first book that built upon that 2006 dissertation, and in great part inspired by Anglos and Mexicans. Sticky note number 4, pink note with scribbled on it, rise of commercial agriculture. One of the most fascinating analyses in the book that had an influence on my own scholarship was Montejano's rich description, almost minutia-like description of commercialization of agriculture and workers and families' place in it. To me, it was quite a compelling history of the rise of commercial agriculture and how it was both shaped by and had consequences on all kinds of things. On labor activism, on food, on culture, on politics, diplomatic relations, language, education, identity, and certainly gender. I consumed this history, and while there were some examples of women's experiences in this process, reading the book made me want to know more. I wanted to answer and to prove what Chicana historian Dina Gonzalez wrote about in her own book, Refusing the Favor, that women had always been part of grand transformations in American history. And so I set out to do this. I wanted to know how women workers experience this process, how ideas about gender influence the kind of work, the kind of tasks they perform, and how their labor built not only the valley, but the greater Mexican borderlands. And by default, both the United States and Mexico. Sticky note number 5, yellow note, scribbled on it, ¿Dónde está el noreste mexicano? Where is the Mexico Northeast? Well, for those of you who know me as a Chicano historian, as a Mexicanist, you know that that's always on my mind. Montejano's work and inclusion of some key transnational labor and political brokers, who were prominent in South Texas, were also prominent in places like Coahuila, Tamaulipas, and certainly Nuevo León. Montejano's work helped me come up with a conceptual framework to trace the emergence of the Borderlands region through the lens of gender, class, race, and capital. It served an equally important role in helping me think about the various connections between workers, labor leaders, thinkers, and others that sustain transborder and often transatlantic conversations about labor and labor activism. And this was so crucial in getting me to the finish line to complete my second book, and so the influence of Montejano remained. Do I have time for one more sticky note? So sticky note, pink note, scribbled on it, actually a drawing of a sad face, and then the word Rangers. I was not surprised to read what I read as a graduate student about the Texas Rangers and violence in Anglos and Mexicans. I had heard about Rangers. I was one of the lucky ones. I had heard about the Rangers and their abuse of power from the corridos that my father played during our weekend barbecues. And one of the most, the corrido that always played was like religion, was the ballad of Gregorio Cortés, El Corrido de Gregorio Cortés, at least one version performed by Ramón Ayala y los Bravos del Norte. And that was my first exposure to the Rangers. Hearing my dad refer to them as rinches, not rangers, and sometimes with a rhyming expletive. Can I cuss here? Are we allowed to cuss? Los pinche rinches, as my good friend Chris Carmona reminds us of, right? So more recently, turned to Montejano once again for his coverage on the Rangers as I finished a book that revisits the Gregorio Cortés, the near lynching of Gregorio Cortés in 1901 from a transnational and gender perspective. And I can't tell you how important this book has been for our own public history project, Refusing to Forget. Ben can also tell you the same thing, I'm sure. And just last week, I referenced a quote from Montejano in my Chicano history class at A&M. And yes, we still offer Chicano history at A&M, and we will fight hard to keep that class. So I shared the following lyrics. It's an official patrol song of the Rangers circa 1900. And it is quite visible at the beginning of one of the sections in Anglos and Mexicans. And I quote, "Oh, bury me not on the lone prairie, where the wild coyotes will howl o'er me, in a narrow grave just 6 by 3, where all the Mexicans ought to be." End of quote. And my students were mesmerized. And one of them even said, I had no idea the Rangers felt that way about Mexicans. including Mexican Americans. And I'm happy to share that, as you all probably know, that there has been recent writing on Rangers' frequent abuse of power. And, I think it's really important to keep Anglos and Mexicans in mind, because it is a reminder about the need for us to continue to document the abuse of power, especially when it's coming from the state and state representatives, as we're seeing in many different corners of our nation, especially seeing state agents abuse their power when dealing with children. And just to close here, not any more sticky notes, not sharing my thoughts on those sticky notes, but just answering some questions that some of the graduate student organizers had sent us about, the value of Montejano's work. And there was a question about whether or not Anglos and Mexicans should be considered part of the canon. And I'm not a fan of the word canon, and I'm not a fan of the concept like canonical works, but it has been. It has been for many, many years, and for good reason. I just learned that not recently, I think this was in the late 90s, that Anglos and Mexicans was translated in Spanish and published in Mexico. I'm really happy to hear about that. I had a long comment about the need for translation, and I think we need to do, and I would be happy to do this, to begin to promote, do a better job in promoting the book in Mexico. There has been recent interest, scholarly interest in Estudios Mexico-Americanos, Chicano studies in Mexico, and I think this would be, it's a great text to continue to promote among Mexican colleagues. And I think Montejano's work also reminds us of the need to continue to expand the field of women and gender history. We need standalone studies, but also from a comparative perspective. I think those are pretty urgent, especially examining Mexican American and African American women, and how, in the past and to this day, they still are fighting to prove once and for all that their history, that those fields are legitimate. It is 2026, and we are still fighting for this history to be deemed legitimate. There's still much to do. They can close women and gender studies programs like they did on my campus. They can also consolidate or diminish the stature of programs like what's happening here at UT Austin, but they cannot silence the history. And we always find a way. We're very creative, and we always find a way to keep those stories alive through teach-ins, through other forms, but we're not going to let this history die. And just lastly, it was such a beautiful experience to see a picture in Anglos and Mexicans of Los Quineños working at the King Ranch, because my father was a Quineño back in the 60s. And that was the very first time he would tell me about his experience working at the King Ranch, but that was the first time I had seen a picture, and he still remembers how it was at the King Ranch where he learned how to drive a truck. And then that's the complexity of the labor working class experience, because he'll never say anything negative of his experience there. And he remembers that it was a job, and that he helped to build and to continue expanding the King Ranch, and he takes credit for that. And then I was just, the very first time that I read Anglos and Mexicans, and to see a dedication in Spanish, I think that was the quote that you guys used to, in your promotionals, but that was very impactful to see a dedication in Spanish, and about the place that I had, my hometown of the Rio Grande Valley was just, it was beautiful to see. Thank you.
All right, is the mic picking up okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. Well, it's a huge honor to be here to pay tribute to Anglos and Mexicans, and of course to its author. And I want to thank Paul Del Bosque, Analyses Martinez, Ethan Pena, and CJ Alvarez. Even if you didn't do anything, you're looking good. And everyone else whose work made this gathering possible. Of course, I want to thank David Montejano, not only for writing this book, but for his generous advice and support over the decades. You probably don't remember this, but I came to your office hours in Garrison Hall in January of 1998. I think I've reconstructed when that happened. I had moved to Austin to do dissertation research. I was scared and insecure and perpetually broke, and was supposed to write a dissertation and really had no idea how that was going to happen. You helped me get my bearings, gave me concrete advice and leads on some sources in South Texas. Among other things, you told me about this guy named J. Lou Sines and his unpublished memoir, which is being edited and annotated by Emilio Zamora, then at the University of Houston, who of course later joined the history department here. And both of you helped me to get started, and I remain very grateful these more years later than I want to remember. So it was both easy and difficult for me to prepare these remarks, I think for the same reasons, which is that I actually barely remember a world without Anglos and Mexicans and have no real sense of myself as a historian in its absence. As near as I can remember, I first read the book in my second year of graduate school, somewhere around late 1995. I was going to bring it and have you sign it, but I'm not sure it would have made the spine is so cracked that not sure it would have made the trip. So I came of age as a historian with it really looming on the horizon. And I think it's something like growing up in a town with a mountain or a monument looking over it, right? And that's kind of what you steer by. There's lots to be said about it, but where do you start? So the first question that Paul and Ethan sent was to ask about my reflections on the book and whether there's an affect of reading it. So I'll start a little bit with my own experiences. I'd come to graduate school to study the history of the U.S., which I understood myself, the U.S. West, where I understood myself to have grown up as a Texan who spent a lot of my childhood traveling and visiting relatives across the state and in Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Colorado. And, I took Spanish in high school and Spanish lit in college, and even Latin American literature, and that had a kind of high culture standing, that was enough to make it into the curriculum. But as I look back on it, I think I completed an entire BA in history and a good chunk of graduate school without reading a single document by or about Mexican Americans, which seems scandalous, although from talking to my students today, I'm not sure how different their experiences really are. So, I knew, of course, Mexican Americans, just having grown up in Houston, but historically, as best I can recreate, I was so ignorant, and I don't think exceptionally ignorant, that the Mexican American historical figures I knew were Cesar Chavez, because they named lots of streets after him, Santa Anna, who was super bad, right? I remember him from 7th grade, and Pancho Villa, who I thought was a bandit, and then the literature prof in college said he was one of the leading revolutionaries of his generation. My little 19-year-old head blew up. So it was among the first books about Mexican American history I read. It was like turning on a stage light. I was trying to find the right metaphor. At first it's like blinding, and then it illuminates a landscape that you thought you knew and shows a world that has some familiarity to it, in a new light. And I could recognize the contours of the sweep of Texas history that I had been taught, but seen sideways from this different point of view. And I could, in some ways, trace my own family's history through this, and then, had some understanding, these were the people, and the next row over in the cotton fields where my mother's grandparents made their living. These were the people who, wore the same uniform and carried guns in France and the Pacific and Korea and Vietnam next to my grandfathers and uncles. And of course, in the process of reading this Anglos and Mexicans, I came across this, massive racial violence, mostly in the Valley in the 19 teens, and I was just kind of astonished that I had never heard of it. And of course, it turned out, there had been a fair amount written about that, but I had made it in my 20s and, was pursuing an advanced degree without ever having heard of that. So, hugely influential personally, as well as intellectually. I also asked, what are our views on it in the historiography? And, someone who's nodded at this, I think it's worth kind of, just stating the core argument or core framework of the book. And he says on page 8, if a straight line were teased from an entangled web of directions, Texas border history could be interpreted in terms of a succession of class societies, each with distinct ethnic relations. A Spanish-Mexican hacienda society undermined by the Mexican War in the mid-19th century. B, an Anglo-Mexican ranch society undermined by an agricultural revolution at the turn of the century. C, a segregated farm society undermined by World War and an urban industrial revolution in the mid-20th century. And D, a pluralistic urban industrial society for the latter half of the 20th century. He goes on to say this book is organized to describe the sequence of class orders and the corresponding changes in Mexican-Anglo relations. And the periods referred to are incorporation, reconstruction, segregation, and integration. And, this came out of, I think, a trend or an intellectual stream in Chicano studies, and, the sociologist Mario Barrera and the historian Albert Camarillo's work picking up similar things about class structure and racialization. It was simultaneously a deeply regional history, right? So we get major events and figures of the Texas-Mexico borderlands over 150 years, a glossing of cultural and political developments with these wonderful deep dives into particular sources like land sales. And then I remember, who here started off thinking that, county borders and the divisions of counties could be remotely interesting, but it turned out it made a huge difference, right, in terms of the tenor of your life. So I still remember the icons of the little tractors, right, in some of the counties. So it was, deeply regional, right, but also at the same time broadly informed. It drew on a wide range of readings in historical sociology about rural class structure, probably written by people who had never been to Mexico or South Texas or didn't know anything about it, but were nonetheless asking questions that could be fruitfully pursued in that context, and the connections between rural class structure and the emergence of democracy and more authoritarian regimes across the globe in the 20th century. It strikes me now that this is a very materialist book in terms of its core analysis that came out right as the history profession was really making the cultural turn and pursuing centering questions of identity, often in ways that weren't always, or sometimes in ways that weren't always, rooted in a kind of material reality. If I had to summarize its historiographic importance in just a few sentences, it would be by making 2 points. First, by looking inward to Mexican-American history, the book gives a framework and periodization to the field of the incorporation of the Spanish-Mexican class system into the U.S. by conquest, its reshaping by economic modernization later in the 19th century, the increased marginalization and racialization of Mexican descent people in the early 20th century, and the winning of greater freedoms in a more pluralistic context after World War II. Now, obviously, Montejano's subject was Texas, but there are enough analogs in the rest of the Southwest to make this a useful framework for the entire region, and thus for all of Mexican-American history, or almost all of Mexican-American history for nearly a century after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And if I spent some time last week scrolling through the over 2,000 citations that the book has in Google Scholar, even in recent years, and it conveys a sense of how foundational this book is and remains to Mexican-American history. I think a lot of people use it in the same way I do. It almost became a kind of reference book, right? And I think it's been a long time. I reread it in December in preparation for this from start to finish, but I usually use it as a kind of encyclopedia, and grounding text. The second contribution, in a way you could say, looks outward to U.S. history as a whole to show how fundamental a factor Mexican Americans were. And here the second half of the title, after the word in, is key. Anglos and Mexicans are the actors, the making of Texas is the result. To put this another way, Mexican American history is U.S. history. You cannot understand this country if you don't take into account the fact that it expanded by conquest, including by legitimizing the 1836 Texas Revolution, and then, of course, by defeating Mexico, taking much of its north in 1848. I don't believe that he used the term. I was scrolling through the book because it hadn't yet been theorized or widely employed or maybe even coined, I'm not sure. But Montejano put settler colonialism at the heart of U.S. history. And again, in that sense, way ahead of his time. And part of this, I think, was this ability to write something that was both Mexican-American and influential on U.S. history, both Mexican-American history and U.S. history, comes from the trajectory of the work, right? From the uneven incorporation and increasing racialization of Mexican descent people to a greater pluralism and achievement of some basic civil rights. This was clearly a story that could be readily integrated into a wider narrative of U.S. history and the contested emergence of a more pluralistic, equal society after World War II. As an extension of this last point, where I guess kind of support for it, it's worth noting that Anglos and Mexicans received praise and accolades that only a few, and maybe no, academic studies of Mexican-American history had before outside of the field itself. This is one book whose importance was quickly recognized. It won a number of prizes, including the Frederick Jackson Turner Award from the OAH for the best first book on U.S. history, and a similar one from the AHA's Pacific Coast branch. So, just to underscore this, best book on U.S. history, right? Not Texas history, not Mexican-American history, not ethnic studies, though, of course, it was lauded in those circles as well, and as all of those things. And so this is the kind of statement that invites immediate rebuttal, especially from an audience as knowledgeable as this one. But I think Anglos and Mexicans was maybe the first book on Mexican-American history to be so lauded by U.S. history or historians as a whole. It was followed in 1993 by George Sanchez's Becoming Mexican-American, 1998 by Neil Foley's The White Scourge, and in a different way in 2003 in May Nye's Impossible Subjects. And, I have a kind of side note on Paredes, right, coming out of this university as well. It's just not clear to me that had, at the time it was published, the same wider impact. I don't know if the United States was ready for that, and I don't know enough about the disciplines of folklore or U.S. history to be certain. So, it was a landmark book, right, and not just for the author and for the book itself, but for the field. Anglos and Mexicans has aged remarkably well, and I'm looking at its author, and I would say not unlike its author, right? I would like to point to a few aspects. I hope it's okay to compliment you on your physical appearance. So I want to point to a few aspects in addition to what I've said that, to me suggest why. First, it's focused on class and race, right, as its foundational categories, and in some ways on the second as a product, an uneven, historically malleable product of the first. But it's never reductionist, right? It always allows for agency. I think it's a really tough thing to write a kind of materialist history and not be determinative, right? I think historians in all kinds of fields face this dilemma. It's one of the central limitations of environmental history. And this really struck me when I reread it in December. Tough to focus on large-scale questions of political economy without reducing human beings to just being like the products of some kind of social equation. But that's done. And the quote that I kept thinking of, I don't know if it's actually quoted in the book, but is Marx's dictum, right, that we make our own history, but not in the circumstances of our own choosing. But I think it also, that framework allowed for other kinds of history to be written and be in dialogue with the larger points that he was making, right? So I don't see, for example, a lot about gender in the book, but then, as Sonia was describing, this framework that he sets up allows for that really well. And, he quotes Jovita Gonzalez's, I think it was her 1930 master's thesis, again here at UT. And at the time I was reading this, it was a few years after her novels had finally been posthumously published, and you can see like the decisions that her female subjects make, including the decisions about their personal life and their romantic and marriage partners, as actually like being a key element in forging the to be plugged into it. So again, that's one reason why it aged so well. Secondly, I think he avoids the exceptionalist trap that a lot of Texas history falls into, and that to a lesser extent and in a different way, but still in a meaningful sense, I think characterizes a lot of U.S.-Mexico borderlands history, right? The sense of like, this place is so unique, so different that there's no other place like it, you know, which of course is true. There's no other place like South Texas. There's no other place like Austin. There's no other place like any other place, but you can wall off, you can say that they're so distinct that you wall them off from larger tranches of the human experience. So yes, he explored the distinctive dynamics of the region, but by emphasizing a series of structural economic changes that came with and after the incorporation of a border region, Montejano set up the Texas-Mexico borderlands and the processes of racialization in that region for comparison to other borderlands, and therefore for comparisons between Mexican Americans and other marginalized and racialized people in North America and beyond. So when I read books like Peter Solon's Boundaries, The Making of France and Spain and the Pyrenees, or the kind of canonical, sorry Sonia, article Towards a Comparative History of Borderlands by Michiel Baude and Willem von Schendel, and they talk about these regional elites making compromises and how borderlands can work in very different ways. I'm like, oh, this is the peace structure, right? Like this is South Texas writ large. Third, even as it made meaningful generalizations about Mexican American history in Texas, the book preserved a sense of the internal complexity and stratifications within the Mexican descent community. Montejano's subjects were rancheros and farm workers and homemakers, but also merchants and planters, unionists and civil rights activists, but also Confederates and power brokers, rebels, reactionaries, and liberals. And especially in the last few years with the Trump electoral coalition and the continued Republican dominance of this state, the press seems to have discovered that there are conservative Latinos. And I've recently seen a lot of shock at the masked agents who apparently murdered Alex Preddy were Mexican Americans from the Valley, but none of this will surprise you if you've read your David Montejano. So I want to make two final points, about the book's long historiographic life. First, there are important aspects of Mexican American history that are best studied from different vantages than the history of the border and its conquest and incorporation into the U.S. It's no critique of Anglos and Mexicans to say that it did not answer all questions about Mexican American history for all time. One of the more recent historiographic developments is the proliferation, especially in the last 10 years, of studies of Mexican American history outside of the borderlands, particularly in the U.S. South and Midwest. And I didn't appreciate how different Mexican American historical consciousness is regionally until I left Texas for Chicago, where my Mexican American students, and I don't know if this has been your experience, Ramon, or others of you, my Mexican American students in Chicago at Loyola understand themselves as immigrants, or their family as immigrant families, and themselves as children and grandchildren of immigrants. In most cases, they or previous generations came directly from places like Michoacan and other interior states, and their experiences have little directly to do with the processes of settler colonialism in the borderlands. And the school system does such a bad job with Latino history. Many of them are incredulous when they hear that Mexican American history started with conquest rather than migration. I'm thinking here of older works like Zaragoza Vargas's Proletarians of the North, Gaby Arredondo's Mexican Chicago, and a rising number of works. More recently, Lilia Fernandez Brown in the Windy City, Sergio Gonzalez's Strangers No More, Delia Fernandez Jones Making the Mexican City, or in the South, Leon Fink's Maya of Morgantown and Cecilia Marquez's Making the Latino South. In these places, ethnic Mexicans came as immigrants and were for many decades a much smaller percentage of the population than they came to be in the Southwest. They often lived and worked and made families with Puerto Ricans and other Latinos with roots in the Caribbean and South America. And there was a more flat class structure, especially in initial waves of migration than one sees in South Texas. Of course, these are generalizations, and to generalize, again, about a large and rich body of work, these studies tend to take a more cultural approach rather than Montejano's materialist one, and especially in the Midwest, to take histories of migration as their paradigm. And here the foundational work, even though it's about LA, seems to me to be George Sanchez's Becoming Mexican American. Second and finally, I want to say something about rereading Anglos and Mexicans in the current moment. And then I have a phrase I said, by the current moment, I refer to ... But among other things, the deployment of Border Patrol and other federal agencies to places like Chicago and Minnesota, not so much to enforce immigration laws, as it is often put, but to terrorize immigrant or really all non-white communities, and to punish the political opponents of our president, and to the related attacks on history, gender studies, and higher education more generally, particularly on this campus, which fostered so much of the work to which we are all indebted, going back to Americo Paredes, George I. Sanchez, Carlos Castaneda, and others. And last weekend, I looked through the table of contents of Anglos and Mexicans and let out a pained sigh when I saw the title of the last chapter, A Time of Inclusion, which I assume we can all agree is not the best description of 2026. And indeed, we will be lucky if universities like this one survive as places as free thought, and honestly, whether what remains of American democracy can survive this onslaught. And when I thought about this talk last fall, I thought of it as a kind of triumphant gathering, one where we could pay our respects to a book and an author that have done so much for us all, for Mexican American history, a field that has taken central place rightfully within the larger study of the United States. And it's still that. I mean, I still like even seeing people last night and now. The current onslaught could, in an odd way, be taken as confirmation of the importance of the historical work of which Anglos and Mexicans is such a key part. Indeed, our society did become more pluralistic and democratic, in part because we learned from our history. And that is what the people gutting departments here, terrorizing my neighbors, and seeking to replace a system that could be sometimes democratic with one based on state violence and hatred are so angry about. I went to graduate school with your provost, the same place where David went to graduate school. And I'm reminded of an exchange in Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, where the person asks Robert Jordan, the protagonist, "Are there not many fascists in your country?" And he responds, "There are many who do not know they are fascists, but will find it out when the times come." And that seems to me is exactly what we're seeing. And so I'll conclude, though, on something of a note of defiance by reading the book's last paragraph. The struggle between exclusion and inclusion continues. What is different from previous battles, however, is that Mexican Americans have become an important factor in the political chemistry of the Southwest. It seems unlikely that such momentum can be stopped. Let us hope that that is in fact the case, and let us do what we can to make that the case. Thank you.